So Matt just stressed me out by reminding me of all those things that I'm supposed to be working on today. Thanks a lot for that. Yeah, so this is an unusual talk for me in the sense that I don't usually like to spend my time in these kinds of venues talking about projects that are already mostly done. Filled with a room filled with really smart people is usually a really great venue to get feedback on developing work. I'm going to kind of suspend that rule today and talk about a work that's largely done, but it's okay with me because this is really a project, the project that Marie Kreisen and I have conducted here in this book, Central Segregation. This is really a project where we were aiming to lay out some theoretical arguments without a whole lot of evidence. So there's still a whole lot to do, right, in terms of the verification of this theoretical argument that we've laid out. And so I'm hoping that you all give me the next 12 things that I should be doing now. Okay? All right, so what we're talking about here is residential segregation. This is a familiar topic to all of you in this room, and so I won't belabor the point. For the three of you that haven't thought about residential segregation today, really what we're talking about is the separation of different racial and ethnic groups into different neighborhoods of a metropolitan area. So this comes from the University of Virginia, and it's a dot map with each one of these dots representing an individual person. So the blue dots represent a white individual, each green dot is a black individual, red dots are Asian individuals, and the orange dots are Hispanic individuals, and the brown are those other races or other groups. So you can see just by eyeballing Chicago that we still have, this is as of 2010, still have pretty massive residential segregation with the separation of different racial and ethnic groups into separate neighborhoods. You see this in newer places like Houston, and you definitely see this in places like Philadelphia. So one of the things that we're trying to do in this book, we're writing this book in the context of some pretty strong arguments that we're at the end of the segregated century, right? That segregation is solving itself, and it's no longer an important dynamic in metropolitan America. And a lot of the evidence that is used to kind of support that notion that segregation is declining comes from charts like this, right? So this is a chart showing trends in the index of dissimilarity, which is, thanks to Doug, the most popular measure of residential segregation. It's measuring the level of separation between two groups at a time. So for example, this blue line represents the separation of African Americans from whites, okay? And the scores indicate basically the percentage of those two groups that would have to move to a different neighborhood in order to reach perfect evenness of the distribution of the population, where every single neighborhood matches, the composition of every single neighborhood matches the composition of the metropolitan area as a whole. So just take that number 79.2 as an example. In 1970, almost 80% of African Americans and whites would have had to move to a different neighborhood in order to achieve an even level of distribution across the neighborhoods of the metropolitan area. So a few takeaways from this, and we've got very large kind of pan-ethnic groups here, and it really hides a huge level of variation in the patterns of segregation within these groups. But if you take these large groups, a few things emerge. So you can see that for all three of these major pan-ethnic groups, there's been a decline in levels of residential segregation. The levels of segregation in 2010 are lower than the levels of segregation in 1970, right? That's not open for debate. But you'll see that even in 2010, there's still at least a moderate level of segregation of all of these groups from whites. And in fact, Massey and Denton set 60, an index of dissimilarity of 60 as a high level of segregation. You can see that African Americans are still bumping up right against that high level. For African Americans, the decline in residential segregation has been most dramatic, but they still remain the most highly segregated, large pan-ethnic group of these three that we're looking at. So those are the three big narratives that emerge out of this. So it's an opportunity to see the world as a glass half full or a glass half empty. You can focus on the declines in residential segregation, or you can focus on the persistence of residential segregation. We tend to look at the persistence of segregation as a really important thing in the context of other big social changes. The other thing that to keep in mind about the kind of chart that I just showed you is that it hides a lot of variation in the level of segregation across places, right? So these declines in residential segregation are averaged across 327 metropolitan areas. Each one of those metropolitan areas counts as one unit as you're calculating that average. There's a lot of variation in these patterns and these changes in residential segregation. So here we have black-white dissimilarity in 1980 by black-white segregation in 2010. So that identity line represents obviously no change in residential segregation. There's a place where the level of residential segregation in 1980 was similar to the level of residential segregation in 2010. And you can see that there's a pretty high level. Well, let me be glass half full for a minute. Most of these places are below that identity line, right? So there's been improvement in residential segregation in most metropolitan areas. But there are a couple of things to notice. Here are a couple of places that have experienced dramatic declines in residential segregation. Missoula, Montana, and Provo, Utah. Shout out to Provo. No one? Okay. And then you have places like Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Detroit, right? So the size of these bubbles, you might have guessed, represents the size of the black population in these places, right? So if we're thinking about the experience of residential segregation, one of the takeaways here is that the declines in residential segregation that we talk about when we talk about declines in average levels of segregation is really experienced by a relatively small portion of the black population. Whereas the bulk of the black population still concentrated in areas where segregation remained really, really high and largely unchanged for decades, right? So we think this means that residential segregation is still an important topic. It's important also because it's obviously been linked in lots of studies to all kinds of individual outcomes. So there are studies showing the level of residential segregation in metropolitan areas is linked to racial disparities in health, in wealth, in criminal victimization, in neighborhood processes like trust and collective efficacy. And all of these things happen through kind of the neighborhood context to which different racial and ethnic groups are exposed. So this is a chart from the book, and just for a reference point, this line represents kind of the average neighborhood characteristic experienced by whites. Okay, so the bars represent the difference, basically the ratio of the difference between all three of these racial and ethnic groups and whites, right? With whites as a reference point. So just as a reference, this is indicating that Latinos, Asians, and African Americans are exposed to fewer whites in their neighborhoods. They're also exposed to much higher concentrations of poverty, much higher concentrations of joblessness, higher percentage of low-wage jobs, higher crime rates, and a higher industrial pollution as well, right? And this is just a few examples of the racial disparities in neighborhood exposures that are important for these individual outcomes, right? So segregation is important. Preaching to the choir a little bit here. Segregation is important because it drives these important racial and ethnic differences in neighborhood exposures, right? That have outcomes or have repercussions for individual outcomes. All right, so this is kind of the setup for the book, right? So our motivations are rooted in kind of the recognition of these big racial and ethnic disparities in all kinds of outcomes, right? So this persistence of racial inequality. And we are also writing at a time, we began the book when in the time where the Michael Brown case and the Tamir Rice case, all of these acts of violence against African Americans in highly segregated contexts committed by white police officers that were policing areas where they didn't live. We saw segregation as a really important part of that narrative. So we're trying to, in writing this book, we're trying to bring this narrative back towards thinking about the importance of space in kind of ordering these interactions. We're also writing at a time, again, where we have these dubious claims about the end of the segregated century. Also important here, though, is that the theoretical arguments for explaining residential segregation have really not moved forward very far since the publishing of American Apartheid. So Massey and Dent did this great job of laying out three theoretical arguments, and we have written in thousands and thousands of articles since then. We've written those same theoretical arguments without kind of extending without rethinking the efficacy of those arguments. So a couple of big questions. There's been a lot of social change, right? According to most research, residential or discrimination in the residential context has declined. We have increasing incomes for at least some peoples of color. And we have a lot of evidence that kind of racial attitudes have softened since the 1970s. So why, with all of that social change, does residential segregation remain so high in many metropolitan areas? Okay. And then the most important question for us, what are the social processes that we're ignoring that aren't captured in those three big theoretical arguments? What are the social processes that we're ignoring in our explanations of residential segregation? All right. By the way, I forgot to mention, I come from a context where I have lots of economists in the room all the time, so feel free to interrupt. Okay? All right. All right, so we have these three big explanations. I want to review some of the evidence that we have for these three big explanations before I launch into kind of our addition to this theoretical space. So one of the things to recognize about all of these theoretical arguments is that they assume that residential segregation reflects kind of patterns of racial differences in patterns of mobility and immobility, right? So racial differences in the decision to leave particular kinds of places, and racial differences in where people end up when they do move, right? So we need to think about this as an important kind of mediating factor between all of these theoretical dynamics and residential segregation. So one of these theoretical arguments really focuses on racial differences in resources, right? So we're recognizing here that African Americans and whites, for example, have different levels of education, income, wealth, and that provides them with different levels of purchasing power when they're making their mobility decisions, right? And so those racial differences in resources drives racial differences in mobility and immobility decisions or outcomes, and that in turn leads to residential segregation. One little piece of evidence, and I'm going to give you just a little snippet of evidence for each of these theoretical arguments. One of the kinds of evidence that we look at here is we look at residential destinations, for example. So we're looking at people who moved in the panel study of income dynamics between 1997 and 2013, and we're looking at the racial composition of the neighborhoods to which they move. And one of the things that you'll notice is as income increases, for all of these groups, the percentage white in their neighborhood of destination increases as well. So the higher the level of income, the more able you are to buy yourself into those white spaces that tend to be also more advantaged in terms of access to resources, right? You'll notice a couple of interesting things, though. That line for whites is really, really flat. So one of the things you'll see is that even low-income whites are able to buy themselves into neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly white. And it doesn't increase as much as the income, so much as income increases. The other really important thing here is if you compare groups, members of groups with the same level of income, you still have these gigantic gaps in neighborhood outcomes. So income explains a little bit of the differences in residential outcomes that shape residential segregation, but certainly not all of it. Okay? So the second theoretical argument is, okay, if people are entering into neighborhoods that have really different racial compositions, even when they have the same level of income, maybe it's preferences, right? Maybe just this just reflects the tendency for like to like, right? For people to sort into neighborhoods where they can be around people of their own race, or to avoid, to think of the opposite side of that coin, to avoid members of other races. So we have lots of evidence on this as well, on racial and ethnic differences in preferences, and so this really boils down a lot of data from the Detroit area study, the Chicago area study, and NCSUE. And a couple of things to notice here. So we've got the most desired and the least desired of three different groups. A couple of things to notice. All three of these racial and ethnic groups tend to say that their most desirous neighborhood, their most desired neighborhood, are neighborhoods that have fairly large concentrations of their own group, right? So there's some evidence for this idea that people sort towards neighborhoods that have large concentrations of their own group. But a couple of other things to notice here. Whites kind of stand out in terms of their lack of affinity or their disaffinity for neighborhoods that have high concentrations of non-whites. And really, if you dig deeper into the research, it shows that as the concentration of African Americans in particular increases in a neighborhood, then the preference for that neighborhood really goes down among whites. And that's true even in the most recent data that we have. So this points to a disaffinity for non-white neighbors among whites. Focus on African Americans for a second. What do you notice about the bars there? They're really pretty damn similar, right? So this is the contrast between the least desired and the most desired neighborhoods. So African Americans are distinct in these preference studies because the band of preferred neighborhoods is pretty narrow. They tend to prefer pretty integrated neighborhoods, right? From least preferred to most preferred, they're pretty damn integrated neighborhoods, right? The important thing here, and I'll come back to this in just a second, is that African Americans in particular end up in neighborhoods where the gap between their preferences and the actual racial composition to which they're exposed is huge, right? So they're not realizing those preferences so much. So one of the knocks on the kind of research that we look at with preferences is that it's happening in a vacuum, right? We're showing people show cards, or we're asking people to write down, to draw their ideal neighborhood, and it's not in the context of actual residential mobility. So one of the questions is always, well, do those preferences match up with residential mobility patterns? And the answer is yes and no. Always yes and no, right? You can guess that that's the answer. So this is, again, coming from data from the panel study of income dynamics. And here what we're looking at is basically the white flight question. And one of the things that you'll notice, pretend that these, the red, the green, and the blue house, they're all occupied by a white family, right? And one of the things that we know from this study is that the family here, right, this family where they're surrounded by white neighbors, are less likely to move than this family or this family, right? So, and this is controlling for, you know, age and family composition and income and wealth and everything else that you can throw at it. Residential or metropolitan context, that effect of non-white concentration holds up to all of those controls. But that extra local context also matters. What's going on in the surrounding neighborhoods also matters. So if you compare just this red and the green, the folks in the green house are much more likely to move than the folks in the red house, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive. If it's a simple white flight thing, you would think that these folks would be most likely to leave because they're not only in a neighborhood that has a relatively high concentration of non-whites, but they're surrounded by other neighborhoods that have high concentration of non-whites. Does that make sense? But these folks are actually less likely to leave than are these folks. And we think that this is because it's just reflecting kind of the distance dependence of residential mobility, right? So people tend to move to relatively nearby locations. And so if this family leaves to a relatively nearby location, they're not going to improve their neighborhood in terms of the racial composition. They're going to move to a neighborhood that still has a high concentration of non-whites, whereas this household could move to an adjacent neighborhood and end up in a neighborhood that has a lower concentration of non-whites, right? So these folks are more likely to move. And part of this, the reason I bring this up is it took me a long time to figure out what was going on here. It's kind of a urban demographer. I just want to say, oh, it's just distance dependence of move, but there's a cognitive process that's happening here as well, right? When people are searching for housing, they're considering the areas that they're most knowledgeable about, which tend to be the places that are closest by, right? So there's a social process underlying this distance dependence that I think becomes an important part of this story. And I'll come back to that in a second. All right. So one other thing that I wanted to point out here, and I mentioned that I'd come back to this, so finally meeting a promise, my kids would be shocked. So one of the things that we want to look at is that we can look at the disparity between what people say they want and where they're actually living. And you'll notice that for all of these groups, there's a pretty wide gap between what they say they prefer and where they're actually living. All of these groups are living in neighborhoods that have higher concentrations of their own groups than they express when we talk about their residential preferences. The other part of this, and this comes from a study that we did in Washington, D.C. With folks at the Urban Institute, and we asked people, we followed people as they were actually searching for housing. And we looked at the racial composition of the neighborhoods in which they were searching. And what we found here is that for African Americans and Latinos, they were searching in places that had racial compositions that were pretty similar to what they said they desired, right? Where the disparity emerged was where they actually ended up living, right? So they were searching in all kinds of places, but ended up living in places that had high concentrations of their own group. It's different for whites. They're searching for places, they're searching in places that have much higher concentrations of whites than they say that they prefer, okay? And they end up in the whitest of those neighborhoods, okay? So again, a big point here is there's something going on with these search processes that should reveal quite a bit about the kind of perpetuation of racial differences in mobility outcomes that we've totally been ignoring. Okay? So come back to that as well. The third explanation is, okay, if it's not income, if African Americans, for example, are saying that they prefer more immigration than they're actually experiencing, maybe they're just blocked from that integration by acts of discrimination. And there is certainly lots of evidence that discrimination, despite some evidence that it's declining, it's still a strong force in the processes of residential stratification. We can think about two big kinds of discrimination. I'm not even going to come close to doing the justice to the large body of really good literature on this. But we can think about institutionalized forms of discrimination or institutionalized racism as manifested in things like redlining, which was, it's been illegal since 1968, but lots of evidence that it still happens in the context of like mortgage lending. And a lot of my other research, including a lot of research with Matt Hall, shows kind of a disinvestment from neighborhoods that have high concentrations of people of color, and you see this in patterns of foreclosure and rebound after the Great Recession. And then you've got a variety of different kinds of interpersonal discrimination as well. So audit studies show that kind of exclusionary discrimination is becoming less common. So it's less common now for people to show up and say, hey, I want to rent this unit, and the landlord says, no, I don't rent to your kind. That's less common now, those overt forms of discrimination. But there are still lots of subtle or non-exclusionary forms of discrimination for which we have lots of evidence. Things like racial steering, disparities in the services, and interpersonal aggression even to residents that live in these places that might affect mobility decisions. One of the things, so we have lots of evidence of discrimination out there, but one of the things that has always been discomforting to me in the residential mobility and segregation literature is that we tend to think about the evidence for discrimination and its impact on segregation as a residual effect, right? So we take into consideration people's preferences, we take into consideration people's income or resources, and anything that's left over, we expect that to represent the effects of discrimination. Okay? And I bring this, and I think discrimination is a really important force, but I bring this up because that should kind of rub us wrong, right? To think about discrimination as just the residual category here. And it reveals really a number of important flaws in the way that we've been thinking about residential segregation, in my opinion. One is, we often think about these explanations, resources, preferences, and discrimination, as mutually exclusive and exhaustive, right? When in reality, the three factors are intertwined, and there are probably a bunch of other factors that we're completely ignoring here, right? So we got to kind of get out of this notion of thinking of resources, preferences, and discrimination as mutually exclusive and exhaustive. A couple of the other problems that I have with the kind of theoretical space around this is that we think about residential mobility decisions that shape segregation as kind of individualized and happening at time t, right? So we're focused on the present time, and we're focused on individual movers and their decisions, right? So we're not paying attention to their connections to other times, right? So their residential experiences and how that might affect subsequent residential decisions. And we're not thinking about their connections to family and friends and other social networks and social dynamics that might shape those decisions. So it's kind of ironic that most of this work has been done by sociologists, and we forget about the social part of it. And then neighborhood, the third thing that we kind of throw a dart at the current theoretical landscape at is this idea that neighborhood selection, it represents roughly kind of a rational choice perspective, right? So the whole idea is individuals, when it's time to move, they use their vast knowledge of all of the neighborhoods in the metropolitan area, and they identify those places that kind of best match their preferences, and then try to use their economic resources to buy themselves into the neighborhood that best matches those preferences. And sometimes people are discriminated against and get blocked from those neighborhoods. But the idea is we have this vast knowledge, and the city is a giant sorting machine that sorts people based on their preferences and their economic resources. There's a lot of evidence that this isn't how this works out. And this comes from work by Maria and one of her former graduate students, Mike Gator, who's now at American University and doing some really good work there, where they were asking a simple question. Is this idea of kind of ubiquitous knowledge of neighborhoods, broad knowledge of all of the neighborhoods in the metropolitan area, is there validity to this? And so they studied Chicago, and this is a little funky here, so let me just get rid of the double negatives for you. The darker bars here represent a higher level of knowledge for that group, right? So we've got a bunch of neighborhoods in Chicago here. We've got whites, African Americans, and Latinos, and we're asking what, are you familiar with this neighborhood? The darker ones, the darker bars indicate a higher percentage of that particular group that knows something about those neighborhoods. And one of the things that you'll notice is that there are definitely neighborhoods about which a high percentage of whites and African Americans know a lot about, but then there are these distinct sets where African Americans in this group of neighborhoods say, I know a lot about these places, and whites say, I know nothing about them. And then another group where whites are saying, I know a lot about these places, and African Americans and Latinos are saying, I don't know anything about those places. If you don't know anything about those places, they're unlikely to be residential targets when it comes time to move, right? So this is why this is important. So it kind of flies in the face of that assumption that we're approaching this in a very rational way, right? Or with complete information. So our point here is these racial variations in knowledge probably lead to racial differences in search locations, where people actually search for housing, and that will drive racial differences, or at least help to drive racial differences in residential outcomes. Again, not cleanly captured in any of the theoretical arguments. Can't really call this preferences, right? Can't really call this discrimination or economic conditions. It's something different.
Did you ask also about whether they got the information from friends or relatives?
No.
Because networks function really clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the subsequent work that we've done starts to give hints that that's a really important part of this, but we have very, very little data on this. So that's one of the areas where we really need to build out the data. Yeah, so a big question, to Marta's point here, is where do these variations in neighborhood knowledge come from, right? So this is a big mystery here. So one of the things that we think is going on is that there are big racial and ethnic differences in social networks that provide different levels of evidence, or different levels of knowledge about different residential outcomes, or residential opportunities, excuse me. So mobility impacts. We could think about social networks as sources of information, right? So the residential experiences of your friends and families and coworkers and those kinds of things are conveyed to you on a daily basis, right? So they're talking about what it's like living in their neighborhood, and you develop levels of knowledge about different neighborhoods. So where those friends and family and coworkers live is a really important part of your information source, right? There's also kind of a more kind of utilitarian form of this social network dynamic, and that's just maybe we want to move closer to our family because we're providing care or receiving care from them. And those two things are really hard to disentangle. One of the things that we do know is that if you look at the American Housing Survey, which has been done for a long time, and you look at recent movers, 15% of those recent movers said that being closer to family and friends is the most important factor in determining where they end up. So this has been out there for a long time, and we ignore this. So more important than the location of your work, or location of your kid's school, or the affordability or the quality of the units, 15% are saying that this is the most important factor, right? So networks are important, and we saw this a lot in our interviews that we conducted in Chicago a couple of summers ago. So this is a snippet from Lydia, who's a Chicago resident, who happened to move a bunch of times, and each time she moved, she didn't stay in those neighborhoods that were far away from mom for very long. And so she conveyed this as the location of my family was almost like a leash pulling me back toward home. So every time she'd move away, she'd end up back in the same neighborhood where she grew up. So one of the reasons that this is really important is that there are big racial and ethnic differences, as far as we know, in kind of the composition and experiences of the members of our social networks, right? So this comes from really, really incomplete, sparse data from the panel study of income dynamics. One of the things about the panel study of income dynamics is you can link individuals to their family members going back a couple of generations now. So you can look at where cousins and aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters, and mom and dad, grandparents, etc. are living, right? So one of the things that we looked at here was the average racial composition of the members of the kin networks for people that fall into these three big racial categories. So this is kind of the composition of the kin networks neighborhoods, if that makes sense. Composition of the neighborhoods in which kin members are living for non-Latino whites. And you can see they're overwhelmingly white, right? So the family members of whites in the panel study of income dynamics are living in white neighborhoods. The kin of black members of the panel study of income dynamics are living in black neighborhoods, and again, high concentration of Latinos in those neighborhoods occupied by Latino PSID households family. Okay? Say that 5 times fast. Does that make sense? So, in other words, kin networks have different residential experiences. And it turns out that this helps to explain pretty large racial and ethnic differences in destinations. So again, we're back to the destinations of where movers go, right? And you can see that if you just look at the raw differences, whites are moving to places that have very high concentrations of whites, African Americans dramatically less so, and then Latinos somewhere in the middle. If you do nothing but control for the racial composition of the neighborhoods in which their kin live, these racial gaps are cut substantially, right? So just that, without taking into consideration their income, education, wealth, anything else, that one single factor seems to help explain a really big chunk of these racial differences and where people end up, okay? Again, not really paid attention to in the literature, so what we're trying to do here is put together a set of clues for a set of things, a bucket of things that we think are important and need more investigation. Not making causal claims or anything like that, just pointing out some things that need further investigation. We also think that these the lived experiences at the individual level are really important, and this is something that we try to develop in the book. So there are racial differences in what geographers call the daily round or the activity space, right? So where you go to church, where you work, where your kids go to school, where you shop, all of those kinds of things give you exposure to different kinds of neighborhoods and help to build knowledge of different neighborhoods. So if those are racially circumscribed, right? So if there are racial and ethnic differences in where people are going to church and school and work and shopping, et cetera, it's going to help to create these racial differences in patterns of knowledge, of neighborhood knowledge, right? Another part of this is previous residence, right? So where you lived when you grew up, where you lived when you first moved out, your residential trajectory helps to shape the kinds of neighborhoods to which you've been exposed and therefore are knowledgeable about. So again, racial differences in daily activity space and residential histories emerge out of segregation, right? This is just a reflection of residential segregation. Because we're living in different residential spaces, because different racial and ethnic groups are living in different residential spaces, we're also living in different activity spaces as well. And there's a lot of really good research by Chris Browning and a bunch of other people that are kind of showing that now. This affects our search locations. We're much more likely to search in the kinds of places that we're familiar with. When it's time to look for housing, we don't say, hey, all the neighborhoods in the metropolitan area, which one best matches my preferences? We go to the places that we know. So here's an example of how this was disrupted. This is a guy from Chicago, 42-year-old white guy, who says, I'm a North Sider. I was born and raised on the North Side, generally south of the 00 line. Wasn't really a consideration. So not so much because I would absolutely not live in those places, just because that's what I was familiar with. Once I started working further south and started exploring more neighborhoods south, that's when I started opening up my search south. And he ended up living not in South Chicago, but below the 00 line for sure, right? So those of you who are familiar with the geography of Chicago, he's a white guy that's moving more towards black neighborhoods and ended up in a fairly integrated neighborhood because of this disruption of his neighborhood knowledge, because of where he ended up working. All right, I'm going to spend way too much. I've got about 4 minutes according to my watch, and I want to leave plenty of time to answer questions, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. When I say that to my students say, you're going to speed up even more? So stop me if I go too fast. So we also think media is a really important part of this, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. It's an important part of the pre-search process. It's really shaping our perceptions of neighborhoods. There are constantly depictions conveyed to us about what the quality of and social conditions in particular neighborhoods are like, and we're processing that all the time. That goes into our perceptions of places, and it shapes the likelihood of considering those kinds of places. So all of this leads to some key tenets of this new theoretical perspective that we've tried to lay out here. And again, This is a theoretical perspective with very scant evidence so far, so if you're looking for dissertation topics and you're at all intrigued by this, please call me. I would be happy to let you do the work for me. So one of the things that comes out of this is we need to understand the search processes, right? So we're ignoring search processes in understanding residential segregation patterns. So racially disparate mobility and immobility patterns really maintain residential segregation, and really those are shaped by how people sort through their residential options. So I put this over here not because you're going to be able to read the entire figure, but there's a figure in the book that kind of summarizes all of this that I hope is a way that's easily digestible. So here's the full figure. Who can read that? No one can read it. Yeah, even superhuman people probably can't even read it. All right, Todd and no one else can read it. All right. So one of the things that we need to do is think about this search process as a multi-stage process. So over here we have the pre-search process, which is that process before we're even considering a move. And how does our knowledge of neighborhoods develop through exposure to media, exposure to our social networks, et cetera? How does our knowledge of neighborhoods develop out of this? That's a really important thing because it narrows this broad set of neighborhoods into what we call kind of a consideration set. A set of neighborhoods that you would actually consider living in. And then when you're thinking about that consideration set, what places do you actually look at when you're searching, right? What neighborhoods do you actually search in? That might be where the consideration set bumps up against your economic resources, right? So you might narrow that down even more based on what you can afford. And then among the units within that search set, which unit do you end up choosing? So we need to think about that kind of sorting process throughout this process, throughout the entire residential search process. Okay? The second thing I wanted to highlight here is that searches are bounded, right? So we wanted to move towards this notion that this is not kind of a rational choice process. Our searches for housing are bounded by a lack of information, so our knowledge is imperfect, and our choices don't necessarily, where we end up, don't really necessarily reflect our residential preferences. So that gap between what we say we want and where we end up, for some of us it might just represent social desirability, right? We say we want something that we really don't want. But for a lot of us, it might mean that we just aren't searching in a way that's kind of consistent with what we say we want, right? So we need to think about how that emerges. So the resulting residential outcomes can produce big disparities between our preferences and our economic resources and a variety of other things. The third thing, which I think is the most important thing that we talk about in this book, and maybe you're saying that's a pretty low bar, jerk. The most important thing I think we talk about here is that segregation has become kind of self-perpetuating, right? So I talked about at the beginning how we have these pretty momentous economic and social shifts, and yet segregation persists. And I believe that is because segregation has become self-perpetuating in the sense that all of these factors, there's evidence that all of these factors, resources, preferences, discrimination, and these social dynamics that I talked about help to drive residential segregation, but they also are driven by residential segregation. So our economic resources depends on where we grew up, right? So residential segregation helps to drive that. Our preferences are largely a reflection of what we've experienced in the past. So that's driven by residential segregation. Our perceptions of discrimination and our protective mechanisms against discrimination are driven by residential segregation to a certain extent. And obviously all of those social networks, et cetera, are shaped by residential segregation as well. So we need to think about that self-perpetuating nature of residential segregation. It's got a tremendous amount of momentum, so even if you equalize preferences and economic resources and do away with discrimination, it's going to continue on for the foreseeable future because of that self-perpetuation. All right, so lots of remaining research questions. To Marta's point, we want to know what these drivers of racial differences in neighborhood knowledge and perceptions really look like. We have some hints, but we definitely don't have complete information on that. We want to know how this varies across metropolitan areas. So one of the what I think is an interesting thing, we did a lot of our research in Chicago. We're now doing a lot more of it in DC and in Seattle. And people's patterns of knowledge vary dramatically across those locations just because of kind of the force of neighborhood reputations, right? So this is a really important part of this. how do those variations in social networks and activity space and those social dynamics help to shape mobility patterns? So we've got a lot of individual level work to do and patterns of residential segregation that emerge out of that too. So a lot of aggregate level work to do. And then I think the most important endeavor here, to just avoid hypocrisy on my part, is thinking about how those social dynamics interact with the big three, right? The economic forces, the preferences, and discrimination. How are those kind of intertwined with the social dynamics that we've talked about, rather than thinking of this as a competition between these mutually exclusive forces? Let me say something really quickly about policy. So both Maria and I do a lot of work with community partners, and when we present this work to community partners, they're like, "Oh, great! What can we do about this? You know, you just presented us with an immensely complex picture where everything's intertwined. How do we affect this?" It's really easy to say, "Hey, we're going to go after landlords that discriminate, and we're going to take care of that, and the problem is solved." But this is a much thornier problem. So the question here: does that have to be paralyzing? And the thing that we've tried to articulate is, by highlighting the complexity, you're pointing to lots of different places where you can exercise some force, right? So there are lots of different potential policy levers to affect the pre-search process, to affect kind of the shaping of the consideration set, and then access to units are also important there. So I hope that, again, I started out as glass half empty, you might remember, and I'm ending up as glass half full in terms of the policy options. Hopefully, we're pointing to some things that people can actually do on the ground. All right, I'll shut up now. Great.